Hi, I'm Carmen Alana Tibbets. Welcome to the Agosia Arts Studio. Today I am joined by this handsome little hummingbird figure, and if you have been watching my series on how I make doll clothes, you've seen this particular jacket in process. But now it's finished. You can see that it's covered with embroidery, and that's the topic of today's video. I'm going to talk about how I approach embroidery and how I actually do it on my fully lined pieces of clothing. So let's get started. There are two common ways that I approach embroidery in an Agosia Arts art doll, and the first is seen in this Inca dove here, and it's a sort of what I would call surface or topical embroidery used to just sort of lightly embellish the costume. In this case, the embroidery is added to give a little bit of color, so it looks like the edging on the feathers that you would see on a real Inca dove, and it goes around the edge of the coat on this doll. And you see here the jacket parts are lined, but the embroidery is not seen in the lining. And I will point out that this is embroidery that I do after the jacket is finished and it has been attached to the doll. And this is the most common for me because I can decide what I want to do after I've finished everything else in the costume. So do I need color? Where am I going to place it? And I can make those decisions after the fact. So let's just take a quick look at how I would do that. So in this case, just to make it simple for the video, I'm showing you what I would do on just the flat pieces before they're sewn together. So here I have my little jacket fronts, and here's the jacket back, and I showed you how to do that in the past. And so I'm just stitching on this top layer, and because the pieces are lined, you know, they're kind of hollow in the middle, I'm just stitching through, in this case, the wool of the front to give kind of the look that I want. And in this case, the color of the jacket was a little bit darker than I wanted, so I wanted to give sort of an idea of some lighter color, so I'm adding the lighter stitching and just sort of a random running stitch here. So to do this, it's very simple. I'm using pearl cotton. You could use whatever you want to use. And to start, I'll just put the needle right into the fabric, some distance away from where I want to begin, and you know, I can feel on the bottom whether or not I'm touching the silk or going through the silk, and you can kind of run the pieces of fabric against one another like this to make sure that you're not catching it with the needle. So I'll just go ahead and pull this through, and then I will make just a tiny little knot right there on the surface. And in this case, I'm just doing a line of running stitches, and I'm just kind of holding this fabric up above and just, you know, catching stitches however. So if I were doing this on a real doll, I would be doing this on the doll to make sure that the stitches are where I want them to be. And it's pretty easy to do because it's a small piece, and you know, you can kind of do it slowly, and you know, you don't have to do anything fancy, and you can do any kind of embroidery this way. It doesn't just have to be stitches, and usually I don't have any difficulty doing it on the surface of the doll, but if you do, you could always do it, you know, pin your garment pieces together however it's going to fit, and then before you sew everything together, then you can just sort of chalk on there or pin to indicate where you want to put your embroidery motifs. So it's pretty easy to do, but what if you want to do some heavy-duty, kind of detailed or really intricate embroidery? And I don't often do that, but when I do, it's almost always for a hummingbird. And so in a case like that, if you were doing something like this, which is a sturdy wool and a lightweight silk, when you have a lot of embroidery, you want to think about the weight of the fabric underneath. Is it going to carry that embroidery and all of those stitches without puckering or distorting the surface? Usually with a wool, sort of a medium weight fabric, you're going to be okay. Wool also has a little bit of cushioning to it, so the stitches will sink in and they'll sit well on the surface. But if you're using something like a thinner or a medium weight cotton, which is very flat, you have to consider lining the fabric, and by that I mean more than the lining that's in the garment piece here, because what will happen is the surface will pucker and it will pull in and it just won't look very good. So in a case like that, what I have to do, so this is going to be the front of the jacket for my hummingbird, I have to add an additional layer of fabric, and this is not the lining for the garment piece. This is just an additional piece of fabric to give this some body, because if you've watched any of my videos, you know that I don't like to use interfacing. And so what will happen here is this will give just a little bit of cushioning so that the stitches will sit on the surface of this fabric. And this is actually kind of a thicker wool, but it's not going to be quite enough. And I don't hoop my fabric when I am doing embroidery. I'm just doing it, holding it in my hand. So what I would do is I would figure out what kind of fabric I want to use, and then because I'm doing all the embroidery ahead of time, I have to know where the edges of my garment pieces are. So in this case, I have enough fabric for my back and my two fronts. And then I would go ahead and I would lay the pattern piece down on the fabric, and what I've done is I've basted with a light sewing thread by hand all the way around, and this does help to baste this lining fabric, which is actually just a scrap piece of medium weight linen, into place around. And so these are going to be the actual edges of my garment pieces. So I've done that with all of my pieces. So I have two fronts and a back, and now I know where the edges are. And so remember, what I'm going to do in the end is after I've finished all the embroidery, I'm going to place this is the right side of my lining, those pieces together, and I'm going to stitch all the way around. And in that case, I will be doing the stitching from the back side, and I will be following my basting stitches, which you may not be able to see very well here with all of this light fabric and the light basting. But putting those pieces together isn't going to be any different from what I showed you in the video about making a basic sleeveless jacket. The key here for the embroidery is that you need this extra lining, and then you're doing everything ahead of time. So what I do is, in this case, I don't have to worry about where the knots are or anything like that. What it's going to look like on the back, it can be ugly as heck, and it's never going to show. So in this case, I'm just going to go ahead and start embroidering, and I'm not the world's greatest embroiderer here, and I'm just going to do some basic stitches. And you know, it doesn't have to be perfect, it doesn't have to be pretty. You can go off the edges if you want to, and it's not going to hurt anything. The thing that you want to be careful about is if you're doing anything bulky, like I have with my reddish flowers. They're bullion knots, and I have some French knots. You want to keep away from the edges of your jacket, because you'll be sewing the jacket to the final lining piece by machine, and the machine usually does not like sewing over those big bulky knots. And then when you turn everything right side out, it just doesn't want to turn if you have anything right in the seam. So if you were doing stems and leaves and you had stems and leaves going off the sides of the jacket, that would be fine. But you wouldn't want a big flower right on the edge where the seam is. So you're going to go ahead and do all your embroidery, finish everything, and then you would just go ahead and put all of these pieces together, just like a normal jacket. So the key is, for me, for embroidery, to have that lining piece. Now I just do it by hand like I just showed you. I don't use a hoop. Sometimes if you're using lightweight fabrics, you may have to do more than one lining piece. And then I would not press this before stitching all my jacket pieces together. I would go ahead and do all the embroidery, put the jacket together, turn everything right sides out like I do, and then you're going to do that final press. And when you're pressing the embroidery, you want to make sure that you have it face down, so your lining would be up. So here, use this as an example. You would want to have, you know, all this embroidery face down on a little piece of terry cloth or a hand towel or something like that, because you don't want to press that embroidery flat. So you want to give it the ability to stand up raised from the surface. And so then from that point on, once you have everything, all of your garment pieces, you would just go ahead and put your jacket together just as a normal little jacket, and it's not any more difficult than that. So if you're going to do it after the fact, it's pretty straightforward. I would go with a medium weight fabric. If you're going to do it ahead of time and you're thinking of something, you know, more elaborate or heavy duty, make sure you have an extra piece of fabric basted in there. And it doesn't have to be anything fancy. It can just be muslin or linen or something like that. Something easy to stitch through, but something that's going to give you a little more heft with your final jacket piece. So I hope that helps you. You can add that to your embroidery techniques and try something out on your next art doll. So let me know how that works out for you. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for stopping by. Bye-bye.